Welcome, Mark.
Thanks.
Hey, Mark.
So Tom and I are going to moderate this session together. I'm going to be the voice of the average person in the audience, and these guys are going to do the deep dive on the tech. So
The average person in this audience is pretty
absolutely,
talented there,
absolutely. That's what I'm saying.
We need to get rolling right away, as you guys have just announced some interesting news on the Azure front, and I was hoping you could take us through that a little bit and explain a little some of the new features that you unveiled.
Yeah, glad to. So today we announced the GA of Azure Iot Edge. It's a edge computing platform that includes an SDK, has a foundation on security, and is open sourced. The second announcement that we made is on Azure Data Lake Storage, which is the Gen 2 version of our Azure Data Lake Store, and it brings Azure Data Lake Store together with Azure Storage to provide HDFS and Blob API combined on a common infrastructure, so you can access the data using either API and take advantage of all the benefits of Azure Storage, including tiered storage to cool and archival using a common set of APIs. And then the final announcement we made is another 2 regions. So we've been on a regional expansion roll. We announced Norway a few weeks ago, and this week we announced 2 new regions in China. And that it doubles the number of regions there and takes the total number of regions that we've got announced to 54.
So Tom, you covered this. What stood out to you among the news announced?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that I thought are interesting. You guys have clearly put a flag in the ground this year around Edge, and really over the last couple of years. And can you explain, I guess, to our audience a little bit more about how people are using Azure IoT Edge and the types of things that it enables customers to do?
Yeah, so we've got, Satya's got this vision, which we call Intelligent Cloud, Intelligent Edge, and we believe that a lot of computing is going to move out to the edge for a variety of reasons. The 3 main ones are where latency matters, so you need the computation close to the real world. The second one is bandwidth, so there's too much data being generated on the edge to send it all to the cloud for processing, so you want to do some kind of processing out on the edge before you send up aggregations, for example, up to the cloud. And the final one is that your interaction, your compute that's interacting with the real world is sometimes operating in a partially connected mode with the cloud, and you can't rely on a constant connection with the cloud. And so we're trying to build a platform that extends Azure and all of the tools, the development tools that developers rely on, including microservices, containers, machine learning models, out to these edge devices. And so we've got a strategy that goes from Azure out to Azure Stack, which is cloud consistent platform with Azure, out to Raspberry Pi class devices and gateway devices, out to Azure Sphere, which are small MCU devices, and trying to push as much of that cloud platform down to the edge as possible. And Edge Runtime enables that.
So effectively, when you're talking about the edge in this capacity, it's having these devices, these IoT devices out there that are running the processing themselves. I think we've been hearing for years now about IoT. Is it actually happening now?
It is actually happening. So we've got a bunch of customers that are doing real IoT solutions, including Schneider Electric and Tyson Krupp and Rolls-Royce aircraft engines. We've even got a farmer in Carnation that is using drones to go and take pictures of his fields to do what we call precision farming, using a platform we call FarmBeats that's come out of Microsoft Research. So this is really, it's real at this point.
One other thing I thought was interesting about the Edge part this morning was the support for the Moby project containers. Just in terms of how, one of these days somebody's going to figure out the write once, run anywhere, holy grail, right? And this seems like an interesting way to enable that. And can you explain a little bit why people who are looking at these kinds of edge computing scenarios would want to deploy in containers and what that allows them to do?
Sure. So the rise of containers in the cloud happened for a variety of reasons. One of them is that you bring along all the dependencies with your application, which makes it a very convenient packaging format. Then it also has this isolation properties, which keep it isolated from other applications on the same server so that it operates reliably the same way it does in your dev environment as your production environment. And then it also has resource governance that comes with that. So all of those characteristics are useful on the edge as well. You package up your edge application with all its dependencies, and you can push that out using Azure IoT Hub out to the edge using Azure IoT edge. And then at the same time, it's isolated, so you've got this consistent behavior out on the edge as you do in the cloud. And then you also get to take advantage of the whole ecosystem that's formed around containers. So if you want to leverage some third-party application or platform, like, for example, a MongoDB database on your edge device, you simply go and pull a MongoDB container and deploy it out to the edge.
Another interesting component of the announcement this morning was China. You talked about expanding there. Feels like the playing field there is very tricky. Obviously, you're operating through a local partner. How is Microsoft approaching China from an Azure perspective, and what should people in the audience be thinking about as they're thinking about China?
Well, I mean, obviously, China is a huge market, and many global companies want to operate in China. So it makes natural sense for Azure to go to China to enable those companies to have a presence there. As you mentioned, we have a third party, a China company that operates our data centers there, 21 Vianet, and that allows us to operate within the requirements of operating in China for a public cloud like Azure. And we see tremendous adoption of that, which is what drove us to introduce these 2 new regions to expand our capacity there.
But given the strength of local players like Alibaba, Baidu, I mean, Alibaba might wind up one day being one of the bigger clouds that's out there. How do you compete directly against them? Yeah,
great question. So I think there's 2 reasons that we have adoption or interest in our cloud there. One of them is global companies and Western companies that want to operate in China. And the other one is Chinese companies that want to operate on an enterprise-grade cloud. And so that's one of the aspects, differentiations of Azure. It's designed for the enterprise. We've got go-to-market motions in China for the enterprise, and so that attracts companies that are interested in targeting the enterprise.
That's good. Big picture on these announcements this morning. Yeah. Where does this get you? How big of a deal are these particular pieces of?
I mean, they're all, it's constant flow of announcements. So this just happens to be the latest release of announcements that promote this vision of Azure Global, Azure Edge, Azure Big Data for big data analytics in the case of Azure Data Lake Storage, and then our global expansion, which continues.
So Microsoft obviously had a big piece of news, bigger picture with the acquisition announcement of GitHub. And we actually have our second live polling question ready for you. So let's call that up on the screen if we can. So if you go into your GeekWire Cloud Tech Summit app and look for the polling, you can vote, and we'll give you the answers at the end of the session. What do you think of Microsoft's GitHub acquisition? Best thing that ever happened to GitHub? Unsure, taking a wait-and-see approach, or you've already transferred your repositories somewhere else? Mark, what's the answer to this question?
It's obviously A.
So tell us about the GitHub acquisition, specifically as it relates to Azure and your development platform for the cloud.
Well, I think one thing to highlight is the fact that GitHub has been a fantastic platform for open source, and Microsoft has, of course, leveraged it heavily. We've got the most contributors of any company in GitHub. Visual Studio Code is the most active project on GitHub. And so we've got a long history of working with GitHub. So one of our goals, our key goal, primary goal, is to not mess with what's working there. And so you're going to see us take a very hands-off approach to what's been going on, the whole ethos of open source and GitHub's operational model. What our goals are, of course, to make it easy for customers, for our users and developers to take advantage of Azure if they have their repos in GitHub. But we're just going to be another cloud when it comes to GitHub. Developers want choice, and some of them will use Azure, and we hope they do use Azure. That we hope they do use Microsoft technologies, but that's not the ultimate goal of this.
That is the key question, though. I think when I heard developer reaction to the deal, and I think. First of all, it's amazing how many people can still hold a grudge about Microsoft and open source. It's very clear that the company has changed its tune on a lot of that stuff.
It's because the past interaction was so severe, though. I mean,
well, it was no joke, for sure. But, I mean, it's been several years now. I think what people are wondering is this notion of making it easy to use Azure. In making it easy to use Azure, if you're a GitHub user, are you making it less easy to use Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud? Is there going to be some sort of deploy to Azure button that's really big and prominent?
So absolutely not. It's going to be all very light touch. We'll be in the marketplace just like everybody else can be in the marketplace. There's you're not going to see any kind of major preferential difference or advantage given to us over anybody else, and we realize that that's really important. So many people are concerned that we're going to come over and mess with it and channel it all to Azure and really just take fundamentally violate the whole principle of what GitHub was founded on. And so we're very sensitive to that, and we definitely plan on making it so that customers can continue to leverage choice, and that if they want to use something else, it works great as well as Azure and GitHub.
So we had the earlier live poll question that asked what the key trends are in the cloud, and you have such an interesting perspective on this, having come from Microsoft and Winternals and Systernals, and if you were to answer that question, what would it be? Agnostic of any Azure initiatives, what are the key things? Is it serverless? Is it AI? Is it edge? Where are you?
Well, serverless for sure would have been in the list. AI, ML, another huge thing in the list. The other one that we see, edge. So I see those things as the three top. I saw people talking about migration. Of course, that's a very important consideration for enterprises. And then blockchain is another one that we see lots of companies interested in.
Can we pull back to serverless for a second? Because I feel that this, another in the long line of poorly worded cloud terms, but can you explain what you think serverless is and what Microsoft thinks serverless is, and what users and developers should think it really should mean?
Well, I think that there's a very strict definition that's been established by the functions as a service model of serverless, and that is that it's serverless, meaning you don't have to worry about servers and it automatically scales. It's event-driven, so you've got a piece of code that's executed in response to some event, some trigger, and then finally that you pay for only the resources consumed by your code as it runs, the memory and CPU. That is the strict definition. I think that it's being stretched a little bit now, so not all of those characteristics I don't think need to be in place for it to be considered serverless, beyond the fact that, of course, you shouldn't have to worry about the servers. So it should just be, I've got a piece of code, I want to give it to the platform, and I want it to run that piece of code, and I also want to pay for only the execution, the resources consumed by that code. So I think those are the two fundamental key aspects of serverless. And that serverless is just a step. It's kind of a trend that you see going towards enabling developers to just focus on the business problem and not have to worry about the infrastructure at all. And so you're seeing that, for example, with logic apps that we've got, which is enterprise integration workflow, you design your application that way, and then the platform takes care of everything else.
When we had Scott here on stage last year, he was talking about serverless a lot, but it seemed like it was still very nascent. What kinds of uses are you seeing a year later? And is this becoming mainstream, or is it still niche?
So we see it actually becoming mainstream, and I think it's becoming mainstream because it's so easy to pick up now, and it's also matured since last year. So the insights that you get, the debuggability you get. So for example, Azure Functions, you can sit in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio on your desktop and debug your functions, something that wasn't really possible a year ago. Once you deploy it up into production, at that point you can get insights into code traces and monitoring statistics around how your code's executing. That's also something that's matured. So from an operational model, it's matured a lot. From just I deploy my code and hope that it works, cross my fingers, to now I can manage it, can control it, and operate it effectively. So you're seeing, as far as use cases, of course the first use case was kind of background tasks as part of a larger application, or glue code. And I think glue code is one of the places that we see it very entrenched, which is you've got long-running microservices, and then you've got short-running jobs in between them that serve as the glue between those long-running microservices.
How will Microsoft's newfound open approach work as serverless evolves? Because if you think of serverless as functions, it's not the most open way to approach computing.
So this space is evolving very quickly, and so there's multiple open source and different closed source even functions as a service platforms. Our approach here is for our own to open source it. So the Azure Functions runtime is open source, it's in GitHub, so you can deploy it and and build it yourself and operate it yourself and take it to wherever you want to take it, so it doesn't have to run in Azure, it can run anywhere else. So our approach, like with everything we're doing at this point, is to focus on being open so that developers have choice and can customize, just like with Azure Iot Edge runtime that I mentioned earlier.
So I've been lucky to sort of witness some very spirited conversations between Azure people and AWS people and Google Cloud folks, and some of whom have worked at each of the various companies over the years. When you are making a pitch to a customer technically, when you're talking about the technical aspects of Azure, what are the things that you're thinking most about in terms of strengths, and where are the areas where you readily acknowledge that you have places to catch up to your main competitors there?
Well, for strengths, technically I think that it's the breadth of our strengths. So going everywhere from CI/CD platform with Visual Studio Team Services, which is best of breed, hugely adopted platform as a service offering, all the way down to fantastic infrastructure with things like Brainwave for AI ML, which are pushing the industry forward and introducing this new category of ML we call real-time AI, and everything in between. I think, and you put on top of that our focus on enterprise and enterprise-grade capabilities, understanding the enterprise, and I think that makes us a fantastic choice for companies to pick, and even startups, of course.
So that's the easy part of the answer. Where are the places where you most want to improve?
Yeah, this is like that interview question, right?
Yeah. Because you're like serverless, you're a little bit, you're playing catch up.
Actually, I don't think we're playing catch up in serverless. If you take a look at Azure Functions, things like bindings and durable functions are very differentiated, and as well as the debuggability that I mentioned, where you can take and debug your function inside of Visual Studio on your desktop. Those are all differentiation, and I think put us ahead of where some of the other serverless platform offerings are. But going back to your question of what places do we have to improve on, I think that's a tough one, because I think that if you take a look at all phases, Azure started a little bit later than some other clouds, but we've gained a lot of traction, a lot of ground in the short time that we've had operating publicly, to the point where now everybody basically says, hey, we're roughly at par with most things with the other cloud and ahead in some places. So I'm challenged to think of a place where we can improve.
We'll have to ask Peter DeSantis later today
Yeah.
from AWS. See what he says.
Yeah. So moving on into something that isn't really, no one has a huge advantage yet, and that's blockchain technology, which I know is something that you're actually personally very into, and I'm sure Microsoft is as well on a corporate sense. I feel like I've been hearing about this for a very long time. People are very excited about it. It's harder to see how people are using it outside of cryptocurrency applications. So walk us through that. How are people using blockchain in non-currency applications, and where does that go from here?
Yeah. So, well, first, for people that maybe aren't so familiar with the technology, of course, blockchain was created as the foundation for Bitcoin and powers cryptocurrencies. And it has a few characteristics that made it suitable as a foundation for anonymous cryptocurrency. It's distributed, it's immutable, and it's secure, and decentralized. And so those characteristics are very useful in many enterprise scenarios and many organizational scenarios where you've got multiple parties, there's no central authority, or there's no central place where you want all your data stored, as would be with a centralized database, and you want a view, kind of a near real-time view of exactly what's going on as these parties transact with one another. And so the number of scenarios that we see, it's, like I said, it's a trend in that every single company we talk to is looking at how they can apply blockchain to various scenarios. And you've said that it's been something people have talked about for a long time. I think this year we're starting to see real blockchain in production. We've saw lots of proof of concepts projects over the last few years. This year we've had several launches of blockchains in production, including one just last week we announced, or 2 weeks ago we announced. Microsoft itself, our Xbox gaming division, working with Ernst & Young and companies like Ubisoft, launching a blockchain to track royalty payments for game publishers. And this is a case where you want the publishers to be able to see the royalties that they're owed in real time, and that blockchain gives them that ability. As before, it's multiple processes, different systems. It'd be 30 days, 60 days before they'd see what they're owed. Here they can see it in real time. It's, like I said, it's immutable, so there's very little room for disputes over, hey, this is what we're owed versus that. That can be instantly settled by just looking at what's in the blockchain. So that's one example right there.
Can you give us another specific production example of how blockchain is being used in a way that's more novel than simply using a database?
Well, I mean, blockchain is a database. It just happens to be decentralized and distributed. But another example of a blockchain that's in production is one with Maersk, a project we had with Maersk, Ernst & Young, and GuardTime, with GuardTime having an insurance offering, working with Maersk's insurers, such that Maersk ships, when they're going through waters and the insurance rates change because they might be going through a war zone or something, that the ship is sending information into the blockchain that says, I've just crossed into this zone, and that automatically triggers a change in the insurance rate. And then when they come out, there's another transaction sent to the blockchain saying, I've come out of the zone. And so now with Maersk and their insurers, it's all visible to everybody exactly what's going on with the ships, and that basically creates a whole lot of automation and efficiency and removes chances for disputes. So that's another example.
Our car insurance is going to work like that.
Exactly.
Right? You need to be driving down one street and all of a sudden you're paying a higher rate.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what's going to happen.
When you start talking about triggers, it makes me think, are you increasingly seeing a crossover between serverless and blockchain?
Well, so what we're seeing is integration of technologies like serverless with blockchain. So blockchain is just a fundamental technology, but what you want is a business solution around it. And so you'll have basic actions triggered by operations that happen to the blockchain, so that might call out to a serverless function to go execute something in response that might interact with an ERP system, for example.
Yeah. The most popular tech track here in terms of pre-signups was artificial intelligence and machine learning. It seems like there's this shift toward real-time AI, and this plays a lot into the edge. Can you describe what's happening there?
Well, so this is another case where every company is interested in ML and AI, and we think it's going to transform every industry. We're already seeing it transform many industries, and companies taking advantage of AI and ML to automate processes and to get insights into operations that they didn't have before. So from our perspective, we're taking a holistic view of AI ML that goes from a top of the stack and infusing our SaaS applications with AI and ML like Dynamics 365, down to giving developers access to AI and ML in an easy way with the bot framework and our cognitive APIs, down to giving data scientists a great platform for training their models and deploying their models with things like Databricks, Azure Databricks, with things like integrating R into SQL Server and Azure SQL down into Brainwave, which I mentioned earlier. It's great infrastructure for AI and ML. So it's the whole top to bottom that we're looking at.
I think it's fair to say this year that there's been some concern about how cloud-based AI is going to be used. Personally, where do you think the limits should be for how cloud-based AI should be used in applications out in the real world?
Well, so we actually have an ethics board for AI at Microsoft that consists of representatives from across the company that are working with AI to make sure that we use AI ethically and that we publish our guidelines for using AI ethically to the world. So this is something that it's top of mind for Satya, is that we need to make sure that we handle this responsibly, that we make sure that we keep bias out of AI and ML, that we make sure that it's applied for good and not for nefarious purposes. And so that is something that Microsoft stands strongly behind.
Have you published these guidelines?
We've published a book, actually, that Satya and Harry Shum actually co-authored. Harry Shum co-authored. He's the head of AI with Brad Smith on the use of AI ethically.
But this is an ongoing committee inside Microsoft called Aether, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you all were talking about this about a year ago, at least, and so at the very least you were, I think, learning the lessons of the past and at least able to see that this was coming, perhaps before some of the other companies did. So that's an interesting trend there.
So one thing that's way far off in the future, and that certainly no one, I think, has even really developed yet, or certainly doesn't have a lead, is quantum. Can you give us the Quantum 101 pitch?
Yeah.
What exactly is quantum computing? Why do we need it? And what will it allow us to do?
So quantum is the use of, it's a type of computer, or a type of computation, that can solve problems that, using classical computation, are simply intractable or completely unsolvable. In fact, there was just a paper published a few days ago that identifies a class of problems that simply cannot be solved with classical computers that can be with quantum. So this
Can you give a specific example of a problem that cannot be solved with classical computing?
Well, I can give you examples. I mean, obviously RSA factoring, prime number factoring, that's one that would take 100 billion years, for example, to factor prime number that a quantum computer could solve in seconds. And so that's just one example. But if you take a look at applying that same kind of power to scenarios like autonomous vehicle routing, which is one that we see our customers looking at, to material science, to finding new drugs, to weather forecasting, to particle simulation. All of those are examples where quantum computers can do it orders and orders of magnitude more efficiently than classical computers.
So Microsoft has obviously started to do research into this. It's been doing research for many years into it, and you've had some announcements. Should people in this room even be thinking about quantum computing at this point?
Yeah, we think it's coming, and we're optimistic about it coming soon. So we've actually started to prepare for it and help our customers prepare for it. So we've got a quantum simulator in Azure. We also have a quantum SDK, which includes a simulator you can run in your laptop, and we've introduced a language called Q#, which makes it easy, or at least approachable for a developer to write a quantum algorithm, and with examples and tutorials. And so this is getting ready, and we've got many customers actually that are signed up using the quantum SDK to start to prepare, because they know that they need to be ready when quantums arise. At the point quantum arrives, if you're not ready for it, then your competitors are going to have a leg up on you. And so we're within a shooting distance of quantum computers really being practical and showing up in Azure.
So like Steph Curry shooting distance, or like how far off is this actually in the future?
So it's tough to say. I mean, if you talk to the quantum scientists, they're very optimistic, but 5 to 10 years is kind of what we're thinking.
So in practical terms, should somebody in the audience who's running a business or a development shop, should they be, to what degree should they be engaging on this issue? Because there's a concern potentially about wasting time if it's 5 to 10 years out.
Well, and the tech industry always seems to find a way to tell you what the next big thing is, and then makes you wait 5 years for it,
Right.
as you're worrying about how it's going to affect your business.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're working in one of those problem spaces that I described, you need to start looking at it. And I started playing with the quantum SDK just because, like most developers, I'm like, oh, quantum computing, quantum Q#, let me see if I can go play around with it. And so I started to play around with it. So it's just fun to go and tell people that you just wrote a quantum algorithm.
Yeah. Well, Mark, you've obviously got the long-term view here, having been somebody who was essentially hacking Windows back in the day, and now you're leading the next generation of what's essentially the Windows cloud platform. If you were a developer just starting out now, is there one area that you would personally be really interested in diving into, based on the capabilities that you see, like a place where you just look back and go, oh my gosh, I would never have even imagined that we could have done that?
Well, AI and ML, I think that's the place where I'd go, because there's still so much untapped potential there, and we're really at the beginning of this AI ML revolution. And so there's tons of opportunity to go find an interesting problem and then go out, get it up and running really quickly with all the powerful tools that are available to you, from the APIs to the environment for training models to deploying models in the cloud. So things that you can do with huge amounts of computational power and the benefits of the tooling that's there now, you can go really solve some really cool problems.
We should probably check in on the live poll.
Yes, absolutely. So GitHub How many folks have, let's take a look at the results of the live poll before we let Mark go. How many folks, wow, okay. Mark, you've got some convincing to do. What would be your case? You gave a little preview of it earlier, but to the folks that are unsure, the 69% who are unsure, what would you say to them?
I'd say, wait and see, because we're going to prove number 2 right.
Good deal. So Mark Russinovich, the CTO of Microsoft Azure, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me, Todd.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks.